Society teaches us that silence is a sign of weakness. We're told that if someone disrespects you, you have to hit back right away. Walking away is seen as losing, and staying quiet means you just didn't have anything smart to say. Because of this, most people spend their entire lives just reacting to criticism, reacting to insults, and letting every single person drag them into emotional drama. But Mind Stoic teaches us a much more dangerous reality. The second someone grabs hold of your emotions, they take control of your mind. In reality, people rarely look for truth during a fight. They are just looking for emotional validation. They want to see frustration on your face, hear tension in your voice, or catch insecurity in your response. Those reactions prove to them that they can still get under your skin. But the moment you stay calm, the power dynamic quietly shifts completely. What looks like silence is actually pure discipline. What looks like distance is just self-respect. And what seems weak to an emotionally impulsive person is actually the clearest proof of inner strength. The ironic part is that the quietest person in the room is usually the one holding all the power. While everyone else scrambles to defend themselves, they stay completely grounded. While others desperately try to be understood, they just watch. Mind Stoic Official recognizes a truth most people miss. Real power isn't about emotional force, it is about restraint. When you cannot be emotionally manipulated, you become completely impossible to control. Certain people get deeply uncomfortable the second they realize they can't get a rise out of you anymore. In the beginning, they act totally confident. Their tone is sharp but measured, and their digs are subtle, disguised as sarcasm or a joke. They test you with small things first, because most people react automatically, without even realizing what is happening. A defensive explanation slips out, or an annoyed look shows on your face. Sometimes you feel this sudden urge to prove how smart, mature, or controlled you are. That reaction is exactly what they want. Most people aren't looking for facts during a confrontation. They want emotional confirmation. They want proof that their words cut deep enough to disrupt your peace of mind. The moment they spot frustration on your face or hear tension in your voice, they feel validated. They know they have power over you, and they know they can reach you. But that whole dynamic falls apart when that reaction never comes. Being calm completely disrupts the emotional rhythm they were looking for. Instead of hitting a wall, they hit total stillness. Instead of emotional pushback, they face pure silence. At first, this creates confusion rather than anger, because the human mind naturally craves feedback during social interactions. People rely on reactions to gauge their impact on others. Without even realizing it, they constantly study facial expressions, tone, posture, and emotional shifts to figure out where they stand. Most communication is just emotional testing disguised as conversation. That is exactly why silence carries so much psychological weight. When someone can't figure out their effect on you, they lose the ability to read their position in the conversation. Once that certainty is gone, their mind starts filling the blank space with its own assumptions. This is how emotional control quietly turns into psychological dominance. Mind Stoic Official teaches us that outside events are rarely as painful as the stories we tell ourselves about them. A thoughtless comment doesn't mean much on its own. An insult only has power once your mind accepts it emotionally and lets it define you. Yet, most people never slow down long enough to notice this happening inside their own heads. They react before they think, and they defend themselves before they understand. Their emotions move so fast that they mistake a raw impulse for honesty. True calmness shatters that cycle, creating a powerful space between the trigger and your response dot. And inside that space, a different kind of awareness begins forming. You start noticing that most provocations are actually just invitations into anger, into insecurity, into competition and self-doubt. The invitation feels urgent because emotion always demands an immediate answer. Yet choosing not to participate changes everything. Silence does not always mean weakness or avoidance. Sometimes it means the mind has become disciplined enough to recognize what deserves your energy and what does not. People who depend heavily on emotional reactions often become deeply uncomfortable around someone who stays composed. That discomfort grows slowly. At first, they might repeat themselves or sharpen their tone, hoping for a delayed response. Then they begin paying closer attention to your behavior, because uncertainty is incredibly difficult for the human mind to tolerate. They start wondering if you ignored their comment intentionally, or if they totally misread your personality. Sometimes they even get frustrated by their inability to understand where you stand emotionally. But this frustration rarely comes from the silence itself. It comes from the total loss of certainty. Most people feel comfortable when social dynamics appear predictable. They feel stable when they know exactly how others will respond. But composure removes that predictability from the equation. The person attempting to provoke you suddenly loses their emotional map. Without realizing it, they begin confronting their own insecurity rather than yours. Something much deeper also begins happening beneath the surface. When people cannot pull reactions from others, they are eventually forced to look in the mirror. Silence becomes reflective. Their own behavior starts echoing louder in their mind because there is no argument distracting them from it anymore. Anger creates noise, and noise gives people a place to hide psychologically. A loud conflict allows both sides to focus entirely on defending themselves instead of examining their own motives. But calmness removes that escape route, making the interaction uncomfortably clear. One person is trying very hard to create emotional drama, while the other remains completely grounded. Over time, this contrast quietly reshapes perception, not only for the people involved, but also for anyone observing the interaction. Emotional restraint always appears more powerful than emotional force, because restraint proves inner stability, and stability is incredibly difficult to intimidate. The person who remains centered under pressure communicates something powerful without speaking. Their peace no longer depends on approval, victory, or immediate validation. That quiet self-possession deeply unsettles people who are used to controlling conversations through emotional pressure. In the end, silence changes the direction of attention completely. The person who expected to observe your reaction slowly becomes trapped observing their own. If these ideas speak to something deeper in you, please subscribe and continue exploring emotional discipline, self-mastery, and the psychology behind Stoic. Some lessons do more than change behavior. They change the way you move through the world. This does not mean becoming cold, detached, or emotionally numb. The Stoic official approach is not about suppressing your feelings until nothing remains. It is about refusing to let temporary emotions decide your permanent behavior. There is a massive difference between feeling anger and being controlled by it. The first is human, the second is surrender. Composure comes from understanding that not every opinion deserves access to your inner world. Some people speak only because they have never learned to govern themselves. Responding to every single provocation only ties your personal peace to their instability. Remaining calm breaks that connection before it becomes a habit. Human beings quietly measure each other in almost every single interaction. Even when no one says it aloud, beneath ordinary conversation, there is often an invisible search for emotional dominance. People observe tone, reactions, patience, eye contact, timing, and restraint, because the mind naturally wants to understand who is stable and who is emotionally vulnerable. Most of this happens completely automatically. Someone interrupts another person during a discussion and immediately watches the response. A criticism is delivered casually, almost hidden inside a joke, and attention instantly shifts toward the reaction that follows. The reaction becomes more important than the original words. This is why emotionally impulsive people often reveal far more about themselves than they ever intend to. They believe they are protecting their image, defending their pride, or reclaiming respect, but the speed of their reaction quietly communicates something else entirely. It suggests that their emotional state can be easily influenced from the outside. The faster that reaction appears, the more visible that influence becomes. This explains why so many people begin over-explaining themselves. The moment they feel criticized, their voice changes. Their pace becomes quicker. They repeat details that were never even questioned because internally, they're trying to repair the way they believe they are being perceived. In that moment, the mind becomes far more focused on controlling the opinions of others than maintaining internal balance. Mindstork warns against this kind of dependence because it places your emotional stability squarely into the hands of unpredictable people. Once someone else gains the ability to disturb your peace with a single comment, a tone, or a simple expression of disapproval, your center no longer belongs fully to you. Most individuals do not notice how often this happens during daily life. A single dismissive remark can shape an entire day. One moment of criticism can replay inside the mind for hours because the desire for approval remains stronger than the desire for calmness. This is why emotional discipline feels so unusual when you encounter it in another person. It completely interrupts the pattern most people are accustomed to seeing. There is something deeply unsettling about a person who does not rush to defend themselves, not because they appear cold or emotionally distant, but because their calmness removes the usual emotional signals people rely on to understand social dynamics. Someone expecting frustration suddenly encounters patience instead. Someone waiting for insecurity finds total steadiness. The interaction becomes difficult to predict because composure creates ambiguity, and ambiguity makes people uncomfortable. The human mind constantly searches for certainty in relationships, conversations, and conflicts. It wants clear emotional feedback. It wants to know who feels threatened, who feels confident, who feels wounded, and who feels in control. But calmness completely disrupts those measurements. A composed person becomes difficult to categorize quickly, and that uncertainty changes the emotional atmosphere of the interaction without requiring a single aggressive word. This is why true authority rarely announces itself loudly. People who are deeply secure within themselves usually feel no urgent need to prove superiority in every disagreement. They are not emotionally dependent on winning every exchange because their sense of identity does not collapse under criticism. That internal steadiness becomes visible over time through behavior rather than performance. While others rush to speak over each other, they pause. While others react impulsively, they observe first. Their restraint creates a different kind of presence, one that often carries far more psychological weight than dominance ever could. Many individuals mistake loudness for strength because loud behavior is easier to notice immediately. Yet, emotional stability leaves a much stronger long-term impression because it suggests true self-control, and self-control influences people quietly. The person who remains grounded under pressure often changes the emotional direction of the entire room without even appearing to try. What makes this dynamic even more interesting is that observers naturally begin adjusting their perception based on who appears emotionally balanced. In tense situations, people rarely remember every exact word that was spoken. They remember energy. They remember who appeared calm and who appeared overwhelmed by emotion. A person demanding attention, validation, or emotional reactions often begins looking unstable over time, especially when standing right beside someone who remains composed. The contrast becomes impossible to ignore. One individual seems pulled around by emotion while the other appears completely anchored internally. As the famous philosophy taught by Mindstork official reminds us, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. This subtle difference completely reshapes the invisible hierarchy inside the interaction. Suddenly, the person speaking the most no longer appears the strongest. The person speaking the least begins carrying more presence simply because they seem emotionally unaffected by the need to control perception. Real composure works quietly like that. It does not force people to respect it. It allows them to notice the difference on their own. The Mindstork approach does not teach emotional suppression for the sake of appearance. It teaches pure awareness. There is an important difference here. Suppression hides emotion, while awareness understands it without becoming consumed by it. A calm person still feels irritation, disappointment, or tension, but those feelings are observed before they ever turn into behavior. That single pause changes everything. It prevents temporary emotions from turning into permanent consequences. Over time, people begin sensing this discipline even when nothing is spoken directly. They notice that certain individuals cannot easily be manipulated through pressure, guilt, mockery, or approval. And once someone realizes they cannot control your reactions, they often become much more careful around you. Not because they fear aggression, but because emotional independence is incredibly difficult to influence. In a world where many people react automatically to every single emotional trigger, calm restraint quietly becomes rare, memorable, and deeply powerful. That quiet stability often speaks louder than arguments, explanations, emotional performances, or conflict. Most people grow up believing that strength means responding immediately to every challenge that appears in front of them. They are taught that silence looks weak, that walking away looks passive, and that refusing to engage somehow means surrender. Because of this, many individuals spend years trapped inside unnecessary emotional battles without ever questioning whether those battles deserved their energy in the first place. They react automatically to criticism, sarcasm, disrespect, and provocation because they believe every emotional challenge demands their participation. But not every conflict is meaningful. Some situations survive entirely through your reaction. The argument continues only because someone keeps feeding it emotional energy. The tension grows because people become more focused on winning than understanding. And the moment emotion takes control, clarity usually disappears first. This is why Mindstork Official places such high importance on inner discipline. We understand that a person who cannot govern their reactions will eventually become controlled by external circumstances, external opinions, and external people. There are individuals who rely heavily on emotional responses from others because those reactions give them validation. Attention becomes a form of psychological reward. Some provoke through blunt criticism, while others use sarcasm, passive aggression, mockery, or subtle disrespect. The methods are different, but the goal beneath them is exactly the same. They want emotional movement. They want to feel capable of disturbing someone else's peace because that influence gives them a temporary sense of control. Most people unknowingly cooperate with this dynamic. A comment triggers frustration. Frustration becomes a reaction. And the reaction creates momentum for the interaction to continue. What could have easily ended in silence suddenly grows into a massive conflict, simply because emotion provided it with energy. This pattern becomes so normal in modern life that many individuals mistake emotional impulsiveness for authenticity. They believe reacting immediately proves honesty, when in reality, it often just proves a total lack of self-control. Real discipline begins when a person understands that feeling an emotion and obeying that emotion are not the same thing. This is where silence begins changing the structure of the interaction completely. Strategic silence is not coldness, and it is not emotional suppression. It is the conscious decision to remain internally stable instead of allowing another person's behavior to dictate your state of mind. The moment you stop reacting impulsively, the emotional pattern many people depend on suddenly breaks apart. At first, this usually catches them completely off guard. They expected resistance, they expected an explanation, and they expected visible irritation. Instead, they encounter total composure. The absence of emotional movement creates an invisible barrier that emotionally reactive individuals struggle to understand. Without the usual signals they rely on, they begin pushing harder in an attempt to restore the emotional rhythm they expected. Their tone sharpens slightly, and their words become more direct. Sometimes they repeat themselves because silence makes them uncomfortable, genuinely believing another attempt will finally create the reaction they are searching for. But the stillness remains completely unchanged, and that stillness quietly shifts the entire emotional weight of the interaction back onto them. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable sitting alone with unresolved emotional energy. Most people release tension outward immediately, through speech, argument, blame, or emotional expression. But silence interrupts that release. Suddenly, the emotional pressure they tried to place onto someone else remains inside themselves instead. The stillness acts almost like a mirror, forcing them to confront their own agitation without any distraction. This is why emotionally impulsive individuals often escalate when they are ignored. The escalation is rarely about the original issue anymore. It becomes pure frustration toward the fact that they cannot gain emotional access to the other person. The more they push, the more visible their frustration becomes. Without even realizing it, they begin exposing their absolute dependence on attention and reaction. Meanwhile, the calm individual appears increasingly grounded simply because they refuse to abandon their center. No argument was needed, and no dominance was displayed. The contrast between emotional control and emotional impulsiveness became visible entirely on its own. There is also a deeper psychological shift happening beneath the surface during these moments. When someone realizes they cannot easily influence your emotions, their certainty around you begins weakening, and predictability disappears. Most people feel comfortable when they know exactly how others will react, because predictability creates a sense of control. But calm restraint removes that control. The person attempting to provoke no longer understands where they stand emotionally with you, and that uncertainty quietly changes their behavior. Some individuals become louder because they mistake intensity for influence. Others become awkwardly defensive because they start sensing their own behavior more clearly. As the timeless wisdom shared by Stoic reminds us, no man is free who is not master of himself. Over time, the interaction begins revealing who truly depends on emotional validation and who does not. This is why silence often carries far more psychological strength than confrontation. Confrontation still feeds the emotional structure of the conflict. Silence quietly starves it. Stoic official teaches us that peace is not found by controlling the world around you, but by controlling your relationship with it. That idea becomes extremely important in moments of tension, because most suffering during conflict comes not from the words themselves, but from the urgent need to react to them immediately. A disciplined mind understands that not every opinion deserves emotional investment. Not every insult deserves defense, and not every person deserves access to your inner state. Remaining calm does not mean you are unaware of disrespect. It means you refuse to let temporary emotion pull you away from yourself. Over time, this restraint creates something incredibly powerful. People begin recognizing that your behavior cannot easily be manipulated through pressure or provocation. That quiet stability changes the way others approach you, because emotional independence is remarkably difficult to control. In the end, the person who stays centered while others lose composure often holds far more influence than the person making the most noise. Silence interrupts that entire process in a way most people are just not prepared for. When someone attempts to provoke you and no reaction appears, the interaction remains psychologically unfinished. The emotional sequence suddenly breaks apart before reaching its expected conclusion. At first, this may not seem significant externally. The conversation ends, the people involved separate, and life appears to continue normally. But internally, something very different begins happening inside the mind of the person who expected emotional feedback. Their thoughts keep returning to the interaction, because the absence of a reaction created total uncertainty instead of a resolution. The human mind struggles deeply with unresolved emotional experiences. It constantly revisits unfinished moments, searching for interpretation, meaning, and emotional clarity. This is why silence often becomes heavier with time instead of lighter. Hours later, and sometimes even days later, the interaction still exists quietly inside the other person's thoughts, while the calm individual has already moved forward emotionally. The mind naturally wants to organize social experiences into understandable conclusions. It wants certainty, it wants emotional clarity. But silence leaves an empty space where certainty was expected. That empty space becomes psychologically powerful because people begin filling it with their own interpretations. They replay the moment repeatedly, searching for clues they may have missed earlier. Did the silence mean indifference? Was it pure restraint? Did the other person see right through the provocation? Did the interaction expose something embarrassing about their own behavior? Questions begin forming not because someone argued back, but because nobody did. This is the strange psychological gravity silence creates over time. The unresolved interaction slowly pulls attention back toward itself again and again, because the mind cannot comfortably categorize what happened. Most people are prepared for anger, but very few know how to process emotional stillness. This is also why silence quietly shifts emotional pressure back onto the other person over time. During the interaction itself, they may believe they hold control because they initiated the tension. They expected emotional movement and assumed they would receive it. But once the silence continues beyond that moment, the emotional direction changes completely. Instead of you thinking constantly about how to respond, they begin thinking constantly about why you did not. Attention slowly turns inward toward their own uncertainty. This reversal happens naturally without force, manipulation, or confrontation. The person who originally tried to disturb your peace becomes trapped inside their own unresolved thoughts. The mind keeps searching for emotional confirmation that never arrived, and because no clear reaction exists to analyze, interpretation expands endlessly in its place. Silence often says less externally while creating far more internally. There is something deeply revealing about this process because it exposes how dependent many people are on immediate emotional feedback. Modern life trains individuals to expect instant reactions to almost everything. Messages receive quick replies, opinions receive instant responses, and emotions are displayed publicly and constantly reinforced. Because of this, delayed emotional resolution feels unnatural to many people. Silence slows everything down. It removes the emotional speed most individuals rely on during conflict. And once emotional speed disappears, self-awareness becomes much harder to avoid. A person replaying your silence repeatedly is often confronting their own behavior more than yours. Without an argument distracting them, they start noticing their tone, their intentions, and the emotional energy they carried into the interaction. This is why unresolved silence can become so psychologically heavy. It quietly forces reflection without directly demanding it. None of this requires emotional games or calculated manipulation. The purpose of restraint is never to punish others with silence or create artificial distance. The deeper purpose is protecting your clarity. The Stoic mind values peace because peace preserves judgment. Once emotion takes complete control, perspective narrows and impulsive behavior follows easily. Remaining calm prevents temporary tension from becoming permanent psychological noise. Over time, people begin sensing this stability even when nothing is explained directly. They recognize that certain individuals cannot easily be pulled into emotional chaos, and that realization changes interactions before conflict even begins. In the end, silence becomes powerful, not because it dominates others, but because it prevents others from dominating your inner state. The person who stays grounded walks away free, while the person who chased emotional control often remains trapped long after the moment has ended completely. Something revealing begins happening when emotional reactions disappear from an interaction. At first, the person provoking the tension usually appears controlled and subtle, and their comments are indirect enough to create plausible deniability. A sarcastic remark is hidden behind humor. A dismissive tone is disguised as honesty. Small insults are delivered carefully so they can later be explained away as misunderstandings if necessary. This ambiguity protects them because emotional reactions from other people become the center of attention, instead of the behavior that caused the reaction in the first place. Once someone becomes visibly irritated or defensive, the focus immediately shifts toward the emotional response. The original behavior fades quietly into the background. This is why many manipulative individuals depend heavily on emotional participation from others. Without emotional reactions to hide behind, their behavior becomes far easier to observe clearly. Silence removes distraction from the interaction, and when distraction disappears, patterns begin exposing themselves naturally. Most people never notice how often manipulation survives through emotional chaos. A person says something intentionally provocative, another reacts strongly, and suddenly the entire interaction revolves around the reaction instead of the intention behind the original comment. the manipulator quietly escapes observation because attention has already moved elsewhere. This pattern repeats constantly in relationships, workplaces, friendships, and ordinary social situations. Emotional reactions create noise, and noise prevents careful observation. But calmness changes the structure completely. The moment someone refuses to react impulsively, the emotional smoke begins clearing. The words, tone, and behavior of the other person become more visible because there is no emotional explosion distracting everyone from what is actually happening. Stoic teaches us that the greatest remedy for anger is delay. Silence slows the interaction down enough for people to notice details they normally ignore. They begin observing not just what was said, but why it was said repeatedly. That shift in attention becomes psychologically uncomfortable for individuals who rely on subtle manipulation, because their behavior can no longer disappear beneath emotional confusion. At first, they may attempt to maintain the same subtle approach. The sarcasm continues, the indirect comments continue, and the passive aggression remains hidden beneath casual language. But without the expected emotional response, frustration slowly begins building inside them. Their strategy depended entirely on emotional movement, and now that movement is missing. The interaction no longer follows the familiar pattern they expected. Instead of feeling influential, they begin feeling ignored emotionally. This is where the escalation often begins. Their comments become slightly sharper, the humor loses its disguise, and the irritation behind their behavior starts becoming visible because emotional restraint forces them to carry the tension they originally intended for someone else. Over time, the hidden intention behind their behavior slowly moves closer to the surface. What once appeared ambiguous becomes increasingly obvious through repetition. The more they push for a reaction, the more transparent their emotional dependence becomes. Stoic official highlights that pressure reveals character far more honestly than comfort ever could. Anyone can appear calm when situations are easy and emotionally safe, but tension exposes habits that usually remain hidden beneath ordinary behavior. A person who depends heavily on emotional control often struggles when that control disappears. Without realizing it, they begin revealing deep insecurities through sheer persistence. They cannot tolerate the absence of emotional acknowledgement, so they continue trying to create movement, and every additional attempt exposes more than the previous one. This is why silence often becomes more revealing than confrontation. Confrontation gives people opportunities to defend themselves immediately, justify their behavior, or redirect blame through emotional intensity. Silence removes those escape routes. There is no argument to hide inside, and no emotional explosion to shift attention away from repeated behavior. Eventually, the pattern begins speaking louder than any accusation ever could. 3. What makes this process even more powerful is that observers naturally begin noticing the contrast without needing explanations. Human beings are highly sensitive to emotional energy during social interactions. They instinctively recognize when one person appears completely calm, while another seems increasingly restless or emotionally invested in creating tension. At first, people may not fully understand what they are witnessing, but over time, repeated behavior shapes perception quietly. The individual seeking conflict begins appearing emotionally dependent on the reaction itself. Their need for emotional engagement becomes visible because the calmness beside them creates a powerful contrast. One person appears internally grounded, while the other appears unable to let the interaction settle naturally. This difference completely changes the emotional atmosphere around them. People begin trusting composure far more than emotional intensity because stability feels safer, more mature, and more controlled. Without saying anything directly, calmness starts shaping how others interpret the situation. There is also a deeper reason emotionally manipulative behavior often escalates under silence. Many individuals unconsciously build part of their identity around their ability to influence others emotionally. They feel secure when they can disturb someone's peace, trigger insecurity, or create visible emotional movement. That influence reassures them psychologically. But when someone remains composed, the manipulator quietly loses access to that reassurance. Their emotional certainty begins weakening because their usual methods no longer produce predictable results. The silence becomes deeply reflective. Instead of focusing entirely on the other person, they slowly become aware of their own behavior. This awareness creates intense discomfort because repeated attempts at provocation start looking completely unnecessary, excessive, or emotionally immature, even to themselves. The harder they push, the more obvious their frustration becomes. Without emotional retaliation from the calm individual, their own behavior starts carrying the full emotional weight of the interaction alone. None of this requires cruelty, emotional games, or passive aggression in return. The purpose of restraint is never about humiliating others or pretending to be emotionally superior. The deeper purpose is maintaining clarity while allowing behavior to reveal itself naturally over time. The mind-stork approach values observation over impulsiveness because observation creates true understanding. Once emotion stops dominating perception, patterns become impossible to ignore. People eventually reveal their emotional habits through pure repetition. Some reveal patience, some reveal deep insecurity, and some reveal self-control, while others reveal a total dependency on conflict. Silence simply creates enough stillness for those patterns to become visible. In the end, the calm individual does not need to expose anyone directly. Repeated behavior exposes itself eventually, and the person who constantly seeks emotional chaos often becomes trapped inside the very instability they tried to create for someone else. There is a certain kind of presence that cannot be created through loudness, status, or performance. It appears quietly in people who remain emotionally steady when pressure enters the room. Most individuals believe authority comes from speaking forcefully, reacting quickly, or proving intellectual superiority during conflict. But human beings rarely trust emotional intensity for long. They may notice it immediately because strong reactions attract attention. Yet attention and respect are not the same thing. Deep down, people trust stability far more than force. They observe how someone behaves when situations become uncomfortable. They notice who loses control under criticism and who remains centered despite tension. Even when nothing is said directly, the mind instinctively studies emotional behavior because it reveals how much influence external circumstances have over a person's inner state. That observation shapes social dynamics far more than most people realize. Calmness completely interrupts this entire pattern. When someone attempts to provoke you and your emotional state remains steady, the interaction changes immediately beneath the surface. At first, the other person may continue testing boundaries because most individuals are accustomed to predictable emotional reactions. They expect irritation, they expect defensiveness, and they expect visible signs that their words created movement inside you. But when that movement does not appear, uncertainty begins replacing confidence. The emotional strategy they relied on suddenly loses effectiveness, and people instinctively become more cautious around individuals they cannot easily influence emotionally. This shift often happens without either person discussing it openly. The tone changes, and the energy changes. The person provoking the tension becomes more measured because they realize they are no longer controlling the emotional direction of the interaction. Calmness quietly establishes limits without ever needing to announce them verbally. There is something psychologically unsettling about realizing another person's inner state remains untouched by your attempts to disturb it. Human beings naturally search for emotional feedback because feedback creates certainty. It helps them understand where they stand socially and emotionally with others. But emotional restraint removes many of those familiar signals. The calm individual becomes incredibly difficult to read quickly, and that uncertainty changes behavior naturally. Some people become quieter, while others become far more respectful, not necessarily because they admire emotional discipline consciously, but because composure creates the clear impression of internal strength. The mind automatically associates steadiness with control. A person who remains grounded during tension appears completely independent of external validation, external approval, or emotional dominance. And individuals who are emotionally independent are remarkably difficult to manipulate through pressure, guilt, or provocation. This is one major reason emotional stability often influences people more deeply than verbal skill alone. Words can impress temporarily, but behavior under pressure leaves a stronger psychological imprint because behavior feels far more truthful than performance. Someone may speak confidently for a few minutes, but emotional reactions eventually reveal whether that confidence is stable or fragile. The core philosophy of Stoic Official highlights that self-mastery is the foundation of freedom, because without self-control, a person becomes completely reactive to everything around them. Every insult becomes a command, every criticism becomes a wound, and every disagreement becomes emotional chaos. Calmness breaks that toxic cycle by creating a powerful distance between feeling and behavior. A disciplined person still experiences frustration, disappointment, or anger internally, but those emotions are observed carefully before becoming action. That single pause creates absolute clarity, and clarity changes the quality of every interaction. Over time, people begin sensing this discipline, even when it is never explained directly. They notice that certain individuals are difficult to pressure emotionally. Their tone remains steady, their energy remains grounded, and their behavior does not collapse under tension. This consistency automatically creates trust, because emotional consistency feels reliable. Most people are completely exhausted by instability. They are accustomed to environments where emotions change rapidly and unpredictably. A calm presence, therefore, stands out immediately because it creates true psychological safety. And others begin adjusting themselves around that steadiness almost automatically. Conversations become more measured, disrespect becomes less frequent, and emotional manipulation completely loses its effectiveness. None of this requires visible dominance or confrontational behavior. The restraint itself quietly reshapes the entire interaction. This is exactly why real influence often appears subtle from the outside. It does not force emotional control onto others. It simply refuses to surrender its own. Eventually, the entire emotional structure of the interaction begins reversing itself in a way most people never expect. In the beginning, the person creating the tension usually feels highly confident because they believe they control the direction of the moment. They spoke first, they introduced the pressure, and they assumed emotional movement would follow naturally because most people react automatically when challenged, criticized, or provoked. That expectation gives them a temporary sense of control, believing the interaction now belongs to them because they expect your attention to become emotionally attached to what they said. The mind of the average person immediately starts searching for responses, explanations, defenses, or ways to restore pride, trapping emotional energy inside the interaction almost instantly. But the moment calmness enters the situation, the entire dynamic starts shifting quietly beneath the surface. The emotional direction they expected suddenly disappears, and with it, their certainty begins disappearing as well. At first, the silence may appear insignificant externally. Nothing dramatic happens, there is no visible confrontation, no argument, and no emotional explosion. But internally, the direction of attention has already changed completely. Instead of you thinking endlessly about how to defend yourself, the other person slowly begins thinking about why you never reacted at all. The emotional pressure they attempted to place onto you quietly returns to them instead. This reversal happens naturally because human beings expect emotional acknowledgement during conflict, wanting visible signs that their words created movement. When those signs never appear, uncertainty begins growing in the empty space where emotional confirmation was supposed to exist. The interaction becomes psychologically unfinished for them, while you remain emotionally detached from it. That single difference changes everything. One person carries the tension forward internally, while the other remains mentally free from the need to continue the emotional exchange. Most people never realize how much of their emotional suffering comes from misplaced attention. They give enormous amounts of mental energy to temporary opinions, small provocations, careless criticism, and emotionally impulsive individuals. Every reaction strengthens the connection between their personal peace and external circumstances. Over time, this becomes a habit so automatic that many people no longer notice how deeply their emotional state depends on the behavior of others. A single disrespectful comment can alter their mood for hours, and one uncomfortable interaction can dominate their thoughts for an entire day. Stoic warns constantly against this kind of dependence because attention is one of the most powerful psychological resources a person possesses. Whatever consistently controls your attention eventually begins shaping your emotional life. This is why emotional discipline changes human interaction so deeply. The moment you stop giving attention away impulsively, you stop allowing other people to dictate the condition of your inner world. There is something deeply unsettling about individuals who cannot easily be emotionally moved. Most people understand social interactions through predictable emotional patterns. They know how to respond to anger, they know how to interpret defensiveness, and they understand visible insecurity because they have seen those reactions countless times before. But calm restraint creates intense uncertainty because it removes those familiar emotional signals. The person attempting to provoke you no longer understands where they stand psychologically with you. They begin questioning their own assumptions because the expected reaction never arrived. Some people become quieter around emotionally disciplined individuals because uncertainty makes them cautious, while others become increasingly restless because they cannot tolerate losing emotional control of the interaction. Either way, the emotional certainty they originally carried begins weakening. This is why composure often feels far more powerful than aggression. Aggression still reacts. Calmness simply observes without surrendering itself emotionally. Over time, people begin revealing how dependent they are on emotional validation through the way they respond to silence. Some continue trying harder and harder to force acknowledgement because they cannot accept emotional distance, while others slowly retreat because they realize their behavior is no longer producing influence. In both cases, the interaction exposes something highly important about human nature. Many individuals do not actually seek resolution during conflict. They seek emotional confirmation. They want proof that they matter strongly enough to disturb another person's peace. But once someone realizes they cannot easily disturb your inner balance, their psychological certainty begins collapsing. The emotional game they expected to control no longer works the way they imagined. Without realizing it, they become emotionally trapped inside the very interaction they created. Meanwhile, the person who stayed calm continues moving forward mentally because they never tied their emotional state to the conflict in the first place. This is the deeper lesson behind restraint. Silence is not about punishment, superiority, emotional coldness, or pretending to be unaffected by life. It is about refusing to surrender your mind to temporary emotional chaos. Some conflicts absolutely deserve resolution through calm communication, and some situations require direct honesty and healthy boundaries. But many emotional battles survive only because people continue feeding them attention. Once that attention disappears, the emotional structure holding the conflict together slowly collapses on its own. The wisdom behind Stoic Official reminds us that the happiness of your life depends entirely upon the quality of your thoughts. True peace must be protected intentionally, because the world constantly tries to pull the mind outward through noise, tension, and emotional reaction. A person without discipline becomes emotionally scattered by every single external event. But someone who learns to protect their attention develops a completely different kind of presence. Their peace becomes less dependent on circumstances and far more connected to internal control. The strongest person in the room is rarely the loudest. It is usually the individual who remains grounded while everyone else loses emotional balance. Calmness under pressure communicates something words cannot easily replicate. It suggests profound self-awareness and emotional independence. Most importantly, It proves that external chaos no longer has unrestricted access to your mind. People sense this even when it is never explained directly. They notice who becomes consumed by emotion and who remains internally steady despite intense tension. In the end, silence becomes powerful because it completely protects clarity. It prevents temporary emotions from gaining permanent control over your behavior, your attention, and your peace of mind. The person who masters this discipline moves through conflict differently. They no longer feel compelled to react to every challenge, defend against every opinion, or carry every emotional burden placed in front of them. And once someone realizes they cannot control your reactions, they eventually stop believing they can control you at all. Most people spend their lives trying to control others, never realizing the real power begins when you finally learn to control yourself. The moment you stop reacting to every insult, every provocation, and every emotional distraction, you begin protecting something far more valuable than pride. You begin protecting your peace. And once peace becomes stronger than the need for validation, the world starts affecting you differently. If this message stayed with you, take a moment to watch one of the suggested videos on the screen right now, and continue deeper into emotional discipline, the quiet psychology of self-mastery, and the journey with Mind Stoic Official.